Hello, I'm Terry Young. I'd like to welcome you to the latest episode of Reasonable Discourse. Beside me is my colleague Shawn McAvoy, and today we're going to talk about the significant foreign policy challenge that the United States now faces in the Middle East with ISIS. And Shawn, we hear this term ISIS, and we've heard the term ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And I understand now they have a new name. Could you explain the challenge that we now have as a country with the ISIS movement in the Middle East?
In short, the Islamic State is posing a unique challenge to the United States. It is a group that at heart seems to want to start up a religious war between Muslims and Christians. That type of ideological thinking generally is not something Americans are very comfortable engaging in.
Sure.
We're used to a political war, U.S. versus Germany, U.S. versus China, U.S. versus somebody. Religious war doesn't really register with us, and that'll be a challenge.
Now, ISIS does not represent, however, all Muslims. Could you explain who ISIS is and what they purport to represent?
At heart of Islam is two major traditions, the Sunni and the Shia. They split many centuries ago over a leadership battle over who should run Islam. The majority, the Sunni, believe it should be elected by the community and you get the caliphate out of it. The Shia tend to see it going through the family of Muhammad, and there are doctrinal differences as well. Out of that majority group, the Sunni, in the 18th century, a small group arose called the Wahhabists, following a man named al-Wahhabi in Saudi Arabia, who claimed to want to purify Islam. He saw the Sunni as idolaters, and he underwent a very brutal campaign to exterminate what he considered to be idolatry in Arabia. He also saw the Shia as heretics that were among the very worst humans possible. They need to be exterminated. And it's out of that Wahhabist tradition that today is the official state religion of Saudi Arabia that the Islamic State is drawing its ideology from.
Now, I think a lot of our viewers will have heard the term jihadists. And can you give us a little background on the anti-Western jihadist movement that begins in the 20th century? Who gets that started?
Oh, that goes back a ways. One of the oldest problems in Muslim-Western relations is the abolition of the caliphate at the end of the First World War when the Ottoman Empire is on the losing side. The Allies dismember the empire but allow it to remain. Turkey, by 1922, just abolishes the caliphate. It's useless at this point. But many Sunni Muslims are unhappy with that decision by the Turkish parliament, and the West got blamed for setting up that abolition of the caliphate. And the caliphate is a position, imagine if the Pope in Rome were also the President of the United States and the head of the European Union. And the Muslims walked in one day and just said, there's no Pope anymore.
Right.
That's the way they feel that we treated them, quite a few of them, that is. Islamic State wants to restore that caliphate, and they do have a very strong anti-Western bent for various wrongs, whether real or perceived, that they want to take out on the West.
Now, I guess the philosophical origins of this movement trace back to an individual from Egypt who was persuaded by of all places, the excesses of Greeley, Colorado. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sayyid Qutb. Qutb was an Egyptian who became an exchange student covering education. He came over here, learned the American education system, also observed American life and was shocked by what he saw. He had an image, there's no evidence that he was exactly friendly to America to start with.
Right.
But when he came here, he saw American life and really believed that Americans were, as he said, insensitive to art, to culture. He saw Americans as spiritually dead. In fact, if you read his work, The America I Have Seen, he really portrays Americans as little more than soulless animals on two legs. They're not even really truly human. And these animals have advanced technology and are subjugating, in his opinion, the Muslim world.
Okay. And so he seemingly was shocked by the fact that individual liberties were promoted here in America. I think he expressed disgust with how men and women interacted even in church.
Church dances, you could see women's ankles.
Yes, you could see women's ankles, things like that. But his writing, though, was very influential on later individuals like Osama bin Laden, correct?
Bin Laden, who was a student of Qutb's brother.
Yeah.
And hence he learned Qutb's ideas, Qutbism. Bin Laden was already half Yemeni, half Saudi. He was raised Wahhabi. So you mixed Wahhabism with Qutbism, and there were some elements actually from the KGB that go in there, and that brings out your modern Al-Qaeda.
Okay.
However, Islamic State has a very tenuous relationship with Al-Qaeda at best.
Okay. Yeah, and that it has been the case, and I noticed when you're trying, well, we'll get into this a little bit about how do you decide as a country like the United States who to support in the midst of all this chaos in a place like Syria.
Which brings up an interesting question. I'm curious about your opinion. How do you think the United States has been reacting to this? Obama has come out publicly recently and admitted, probably a blunder, that we didn't actually have a strategy. Then later he says we're developing one. Then Islamic State was not something we saw coming. How do you read what's going on in the government?
Well, it seems like the Islamic State has emerged out of a power vacuum. And I know some of the criticism, specifically I think about John McCain, who I think we could characterize, I guess, as a war hawk, use that old phrase. He's been critical of the president from the fact that in 2011, Obama went ahead with the full withdrawal from Iraq. Which was in accordance with the Status of Forces Agreement that George W. Bush had signed in 2008. However, there was the possibility of extension, but when the Iraqi government would not extend immunity to American soldiers, did not seem like that we could keep our soldiers there in Iraq. But that power vacuum had existed prior to that with the removal of Saddam Hussein. And it's really sort of ironic that we're talking about this religious war. I think people would look at someone like Saddam Hussein, who was a murderous dictator, who was horribly oppressive to his political opponents, yet religion was not the driving factor behind the decisions that Saddam Hussein made.
Behind some of them.
But he was more concerned, I guess if you were a Sunni in Iraq, you would say that. But
and a Kurd.
And a Kurd, yes, but there's ethnic aspect to that as well. But under Hussein, there were thriving Christian and Jewish communities in Iraq. One of his most valued advisors was Tariq Aziz, a Christian who was his defense minister. But again, politically, he was just terrible to his opponents and murderous, and his sons may have been worse if they had succeeded him. We don't know. But when Saddam Hussein is removed, then we have this power vacuum, and we try to formulate a democratic government in Iraq, and the power changes from the Sunni majority to a Shia minority. And so within that government, the Sunnis feel like they're shut out. And then the same sort of thing happens in Syria. We have Assad, a leader that is hated by many people in the region, hated by many of his own people, certainly not favored by the Americans. But when the civil war begins in the midst of all this chaos, that strong Sunni movement that begins in Iraq has a place to ferment in Syria. And I think that's where the criticism of Barack Obama perhaps is much more valid than as far as Americans being withdrawn from Iraq, because he waited a long time to make a decision about getting involved in the midst of Syria. I understand his hesitancy because we're not talking about two sides there. We're talking about multiple sides. But in the midst of this chaos is when ISIS has asserted itself as the Sunni alternative for many people, the alternative to Assad. And so we're in the midst of this mess now. Let me ask you this. I mean, some people have said that we should have supported the more moderate groups in Syria, like the Free Syrian Army. arming them, providing them weapons to confront ISIS. What do you think about that? I mean, what are the risks? Is there anything in our recent history, say in Afghanistan back in the 1970s, that shows us the risk of being quick to arm an insurgency like that?
Well, number one, as far as that particular question, obviously yes. When the Reagan administration decided to arm the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, one of the Mujahideen helpers, is probably a good way to put it, he wasn't the leader, was Osama bin Laden, who had his own force of Saudis in there fighting against the Soviet Union. Most of the accounts indicate that he didn't win possibly a single battle, but he was really good at getting on television and taking credit for battles other people had won. After the war, he kept all the American weapons and the captured KGB manuals. More to Syria today, there's also the problem of Moscow. In an ideal world, it probably would have been the best idea to help the Free Syrian Army, to overthrow Assad, maybe 2 years ago.
Right.
Unfortunately, relations between Washington and Moscow have not been very good the last few years, and at times Moscow did make it clear if we got involved, if we started to help the Syrian opposition too much, it could spark a shooting war between the United States and Russia. I think that's one of the major reasons Obama backed off of the whole Syrian matter. Difficult to say if that was a good or a bad idea considering the situation at that time. All you can say is it's a mess now.
And the Iranian government also supporting Assad as well. And so we have this moderate group, whoever they may be, who are starting to arm, we're starting to help with air attacks and things on ISIS positions. Is that really going to be enough? Some people estimate the Islamic State to have close to 80,000 soldiers now, much higher than any one organized aspect of moderate Syrians. So how can the U.S. go about accomplishing their goals to degrade ISIS?
That's going to be difficult, and this is where we're getting into a situation where I don't know if either plan is a good one. If we continue only airstrikes, is it possible? Sure, it's possible if you use the template of, say, the Kosovo War. The United States provided heavy air support so that the Free Albanians and the Albanian National Army could go into Kosovo and push out the Serbs. It is possible, but what you're then left with is, in that case, Albania in control of Kosovo.
Right.
We can do that. The Kurdish Peshmerga are a pretty good force. I mean, they're impressive in the field, much more so than the Iraqi army has been.
And a pretty long relationship with the U.S.
Very good relationship with the United States. If we do concentrate on airstrikes and the Peshmerga are successful in taking out ISIS, they would have, however, an excellent argument for independence, or at least some sort of strong position in an Iraqi federation, something which the Muslim world, including our allies like Turkey and Iraq, do not want. That would rip apart the Middle East.
And I was going to say that's, again, to talk about how complicated this situation is. The Kurds and U.S. have a very strong relationship. We've supported them, but yet Turkey, who is one of our NATO allies, are very suspicious of any independence ambitions on the part of the Kurds.
Yeah, they could lose the eastern quarter of Turkey in that area. And they don't want that.
And as you mentioned, the Iraqi government, which now has a new leader, but again under Shia leadership right now. Is there a political option? Do you think the new Iraqi government can involve Sunnis enough that pulls away some of the appeal that the Islamic State has to Sunnis in Iraq anyway?
That'll be difficult. Most immediately, probably the most powerful nation in the area that Iraq could call for help from, and it would be significant aid, would be Iran. However, the Iranians are Shia. Right away you would get into a Shia-Sunni war, which Islamic State would be quite as happy to see happen also. So that could ignite the region in a religious war as well. So you want to be careful with Iran. And that's exclusive of the fact that Americans, we have a knee-jerk hatred of Iran. You just say the word and some people foam at the mouth.
Right.
In a practical sense, they would be useful militarily, politically it could be a disaster. How to get the Shia involved? They're trying. Right now they have a propaganda campaign trying to hit the Sunni in Iraq and basically inform them that this is Islamic State. They're actually Wahhabists. You come from a different tradition of the Sunni Islam. And just last week, Islamic State has called for attacks on Americans. They want America to be taken, they want the war taken to America by all Muslims. So far, I don't see a whole lot of American Muslims actually answering that call, and hopefully it won't happen. And if Iraq can continue its propaganda campaign, it won't have much hold in Iraq either.
Well, and let's be clear: the Islamic State has not only gone after Kurds, and minority Christian groups in that area. They've gone after traditional religious groups, the Medians, the Druze, the Syrians, and they have massacred Sunni Muslims as well, who do not abide by their vision.
Yeah, in Wahhabism, if you don't abide by Wahhabism, you are a heretic. It would be, roughly speaking, just because, for instance, someone's a Southern Baptist, they do fit into the larger picture of Protestantism, but they don't believe the way necessarily other Protestants do.
Right.
So just because Wahhabis fit into this larger Sunni matrix doesn't mean they believe or see themselves as related to the other Sunni, and frankly, Islamic State doesn't.
And the way they enforce their views is what's been sort of just, I think, shocking to not only to see the beheadings of Americans.
Millions of amputations have been recorded so far.
Right, and just the mutilation, the sexual assaults, the just flat-out murders that have occurred of people of all different backgrounds that they've encountered.
Which also brings up an interesting question. I wonder if you can speak to it, because Islamic State, we talk about it as though it's merely a terrorist organization that has simply taken land, but the fact is it's established a capital at Raqqa in Syria. It's actually running Syrian and Iraqi provinces. It actually has its people as political officials. They're running the police, they're running the sanitation, they're doing these amputations, they're running the jails. Even if we do manage to get rid of this group, what do you see for the reconstruction? Because there's going to have to be a reconstruction in these areas.
And again, we run into that same issue, that power vacuum, if that happens. And one of the things that I've found interesting when folks in that region are interviewed, there are people who are not very happy about the Islamic State, but they're being provided services that they were doing without prior to the Islamic State's presence. And again, for a lot of people in Syria, the number one enemy is not the Islamic State, but it's still Assad. And so they're not as quick to condemn the Islamic State.
Which does want to overthrow Assad.
Yes, they do want to overthrow Assad. So, I just wonder if there's some way to work out that some sort of unification among the moderate groups. I mean, we talk about moderate Syrians, those who are opposed to Assad, also fighting against ISIS, but they're not a coherent, organized group. There are lots of different battalions and groups that have different names. The Free Syrian Army is just one of those. So if there's some way to sort of nationalize that group, to kind of fill that vacuum, to come in to retake those areas. And you mentioned ISIS being more than just a terrorist organization. I mean, if you look at a map of the territory that they control right now, it's pretty shocking. And also the resources, the way they're able to make money, the oil that they control right now. It's a battle, and it's hard to see things turning the way we want them to just because we're directing airstrikes at them. Let me mention one thing or ask you about something that you had sort of indicated about this call by the ISIS state, the Islamic State, for all people to act against America. Now, we've seen this occur before with this sort of radicalization of some who have lived in the West. We had Anwar al-Awlaki, who was killed in Yemen, who was the radical Islamist, and that his murder actually, or his death, raised a lot of constitutional issues. An American citizen killed in Yemen by American military forces. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was responsible for beheading Daniel Pearl. He's captured and he's in Guantanamo or somewhere, some parts unknown at the moment. He's someone who got an engineering degree 50 miles down the road from us at North Carolina A&T. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the #1 guy in Al-Qaeda right now, spent time in disguise essentially in California. So I mean, there are connections to America. We know there have been Americans who have fought and been killed fighting on behalf of the Islamic State. So how do we prevent that radicalism from occurring here in the U.S. or in other, the beheadings of American journalists carried out apparently by a British citizen? How do we stop that from happening?
That's going to be difficult. That's another problem with Islamic State. It is very in tune with modern social media and modern, Photoshop, modern publications. They actually have a online journal, Dabiq, which is in English, and it really aims to make converts. And it's, of course, available in the United States. You can just go online and find it. Our values don't allow us to, say, black that off the internet. We don't work that way. So we're just going to have to deal with the possibility that our values are going to allow some Americans to convert. And since they're already in this country, if they really want to do some damage, it's not hard. I think going back to the 1990s, you don't really need an engineering degree to put fertilizer in a truck and blow up a building.
Right.
Timothy McVeigh did it, and he wasn't even linked with people like this.
Right.
If you get enough people in America, or even just 1 or 2 who are highly motivated, we're really not going to stop it. We're just going to have to work on taking Islamic State down as quickly as possible so that we reduce the damage in other areas.
It's interesting, those values of liberal democracy that we have here in the West are the very things that make us vulnerable to that type of attack, yet those are the same values that are condemned by the Islamic State. Those things that they would not have exist. But one other thing I want to mention, we talk about the chaos right now in the Middle East, and it seems like one place where the United States is going to have to look for assistance would be through those Muslim nations that are much more moderate in their approach. We've received help from countries like Jordan and the UAE in carrying out the military strikes. How can we utilize or convince those countries? Well, let me ask you this maybe. Is it in their best interest to stop the Islamic State, and why is that the case?
Well, that's another one of those wonderful Middle East questions. Is it in the best interest of the governments of these countries? Almost always yes. Is it in the best interest of the populations? That's where it gets murky. Jordan, for example, has always had a problem for the last 20 years because although the king personally is very pro-Western, King Abdullah, and about half his country are moderate Muslims, another half of his country is completely radical. And he has to be careful because he's been facing almost literally the permanent state of emergency in Jordan. He always has to be aware of elements that want to overthrow him. Egypt in the 2011 revolution actually did see Muslim Brotherhood come to power, a group that very much sympathizes with Islamic State. The military overthrew Mohammed Morsi, and the United States went through its usual condemnation of how dare the military do it. In the end, though, that was the best thing for Egypt and the best thing for our chances of winning in places like Iraq. So trying to convince the countries to go along, the governments aren't a problem. They have their own internal policies, and unfortunately, there's not much we can do to really help them with that. As much as I know we love to think American military power can solve every problem. Our boys are great. You send them in, they will slaughter everybody, and the problem will be solved. That's not reality. They're just going to have to deal with their own problems, and we're going to have to hope to God that it doesn't rebound on us.
Well, and I think even what we perceive here in America as our great values of democracy. We see that you mentioned in Egypt. I mean, sometimes democracy does not work the way we hope that it will. In Iraq, with certainly a much more democratic government, obviously, than under Saddam Hussein, yet we see the Sunnis sort of got shut out of that, and that helped bring this Islamic State movement around. In Egypt, when we have democracy, the Muslim Brotherhood gets votes. In Palestine, when we have democracy, Hamas
takes over Gaza Strip.
So, and I think we, think that everybody will embrace democracy, but these countries do not have democratic traditions, and these countries have very strong divides from an ethnic standpoint, from religious standpoints, and it's very hard for them to overcome those things.
I'm not sure I'd say, you're correct. They don't have a democratic tradition as we're used to. I'm not sure that I'd go so far as to say that democracy isn't really working. It does work. The problem is democracy is for voting in whomever the majority likes.
Correct.
And the fact is, not everyone wants to be a liberal, tolerant democracy.
Right.
Many areas of the world, democracies function just fine, and people want radical solutions. They want violent governments. They want expansionist policies.
Right.
That's something goes back to the ideology. We really, as Americans, don't know how to handle that. What do you do when you get a majority that wants to enslave another group of people, or they want to slaughter another group, but the majority rules it's okay?
Yeah.
It does cause us to have to question, are you sure democracy is the best way to go?
Right.
Are you really sure that that's what you want everyone to have?
Right. It makes me think of the classic movie, Jack Nicholson, A Few Good Men. He says you can't handle the truth. For some countries, maybe you can't handle democracy. Maybe the way it is. Well, I know that we have not offered. I don't think Barack Obama or anyone in Washington will watch this and believe that we've offered solutions that will resolve the issue with the Islamic State.
We'll have to run a copy of the tape through the White House lawn into the door.
Exactly, and deliver it
personally,
right at the door personally. But we hope that it has at least given you some background information about what is actually going on in Syria and Iraq, and what are the roots of the issues that we as a country are facing from a foreign policy standpoint dealing with the Islamic State. I want to thank you guys for being with us. Shawn, thank you.
Eric.
And we'll see you again soon.
Salam.